call to the 1:30 session of the November 8th Board of County Commissioners regular meeting. And we'll begin with item 12A on the agenda today, which is a second reading and public hearing on ordinance 2209 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 6 to add a definition of premises and declaring an emergency. And Mr. Mokrycki, I will introduce this panel today. Mr. Tapia, Sebastian Tapia, who works in Office of County Counsel. Mr. Tapia, you're AIC still, and you are the panel for today's item. I will begin with a staff presentation.
Chair Farr and Commissioners, this is a simple amendment to Lane Code Chapter 6 pertaining to the trespass code. My understanding is our code enforcement officer has presented various trespass cases in recent past and had differing results. We were attempting to make things simpler and make sure that we're getting consistent outcomes by clarifying the one term that appears to be a sticking point. I included a standard dictionary definition of premises.
Thank you, Mr. Tapia. Before I open the public hearing, any questions for staff? I'm seeing none at this point, then I will open the public hearing. I see no one present in Harris Hall to present public testimony. Ms. Jones, anyone online sign up for public testimony?
Thank you, Chair Farr. At this time, there is no one online for public testimony.
Then I will look around Harris Hall. Anyone in Harris Hall wish to provide testimony? I see none. I will close the public hearing, and we are ready for a motion.
Chair,
Vice Chair Trigger, excuse me.
thank you, Chair Farr. I will, I guess we're moving approval. I'm sorry. Yes, this is our second reading. I'm moving approval of ordinance 22-09 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 6 to add a definition of premises and declaring an emergency. Lane Code 6.150.0050 policy manual. Oh, nope, that's the end. That's the end of the order. That's what I'm moving approval of. And I understand we need a roll call vote as it is an ordinance. Should there be a second?
Thank you.
I'll second.
Oh. Moved by Vice Chair Trigger and second, and actually by Commissioner Buck. I apologize to you, Commissioner Bozovich. Before we go to discussion and a vote, I'll mention that Councillor Bernie is excused absent this afternoon, and the Councillor, well, I went back 10 years there, and the Commissioner Bozovich is online virtually. So with that, any discussion to the motion? I am seeing none. Mr. Mokrycki, this is a roll call vote. I'll call for the vote, please.
Commissioner Buck.
Aye.
Commissioner Trigger.
Aye.
Commissioner Bozovich.
Aye.
Commissioner Farr.
Aye. Passes 4-0 with Commissioner Bernie excused absent. And we'll move along to item 13A, which is oh, Mr. Tapia, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
We'll move along to item 13A, which is a status update on progress of affordable housing action plan. Mr. Mokrycki, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the panel and with us today. And you can, without objection, I believe Ms. Rodley, you could probably step up to the table. You're listed as a presenter.
For the next one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm ahead of it. Stay where you are, please. Mr. Mokrycki.
Thank you, Chair. Steve Adams, our policy director, is here to give this update. I think he has a presentation. They're just working on pulling up here.
Thank you, Steve. Chair Farr, Commissioners, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you. Last month was my 6-month mark in the position of policy director, and I had an opportunity to sit down with the county administrator to discuss the issues that are within my portfolio and the progress or lack thereof that we've made against each of these. It's been 3 months since you were briefed on the Affordable Housing Action Plan. As this is a quarterly assignment, we've had the opportunity in those 3 months to really kind of take a deeper look at the Affordable Housing Action Plan and the specific capacities needed to make progress in this space. Since I was last at this table with the former coordinator of this program, we've had a chance to sit down with Karin Knudsen, who was the contractor and author of our Affordable Housing Action Plan, other field experts, affordable housing developers, our own assessor and assessor-elect, and others who are experts in the affordable housing plan and staff across county government to really help me understand what we need to do to advance housing production. Further, we've had an opportunity to begin to engage with cities, specifically with city managers or smaller cities. Steve Manila is serving an emeritus assignment in the policy division, as you know, currently doing some research for us on housing policy and how it fits within our broader efforts. And, you know, we've had the opportunity really to kind of think about and learn from our housing work as it relates to other components that are within the policy division's portfolio. Most notably, I think, is the experience of Holiday Farm fire recovery and the experience specifically around Blue River. And as we have brought, you know, we're learning there that infrastructure is the first mover for the recovery process, right? The housing has to follow the infrastructure, and we have to get that done first. And that has been a challenge in that process. And we're seeing similar kind of themes elsewhere. And as the community and economic development team has joined the policy division as well, we're really kind of beginning to get a more holistic view of the capabilities and capacities that we have within county government to try to increase our ability to help facilitate the production of housing units within Wayne County more specifically. So I think in sum, I think the real kind of learning that at least occurs to me kind of falls within three primary buckets and a recommendation of sorts that we at the staff level begin a recalibration of our affordable housing action plan in three specific ways, really starting to focus specifically on the capacities that we need as part of a housing production system. We need to sharpen federal and state advocacy to really kind of account for changing market conditions as well as changing political context. Today is election day after all, and we'll know in a few hours what the next couple of years look like in terms of our strategy. And then specifically continuing to focus on removing and reducing barriers to housing development. I really want to kind of turn your attention really to just kind of over the 6 months in time that I've been in this role, already market conditions are changing. We had a decade of fairly stable interest rates in the last decade in which we had cheap money. And we have seen interest rates increase over the last year as the Federal Reserve is working hard to address inflation. And we're seeing that show up in the mortgage market. So just in the last 6 months, we have seen interest rates increase from 4.72 in the first week of April to 6.95 in the last week of data. And these are data specifically for Wayne County. And so if you put those interest rates against our mean housing cost of those that are sold, that's $448,000 house. Just the principal and interest component of the payment has increased by $550 a month specifically, right? So we're seeing this market change. Now, we've had a market dynamic here of, really and truly a seller's market. We're starting to see some cooling in that. So both in the upper right, the number of houses sold, we see a 10% reduction from 1 month to the next. A number of houses for sale, and then the homes sold is also beginning to decline as well. And we see, however, though, in a year-on-year basis, that that median sale price was increased by $45,000. So we can anticipate, I think, specifically that this increase in housing costs will slow the market specifically. And this will be coming at a time when money is more expensive for home builders or those who are purchasing homes specifically. And so the market will compensate accordingly. I was particularly interested in the geography of our housing market. I think really some insights can be gleaned, but this is really just kind of a snapshot in time. Just according to Realtor.com, we have 1,629 existing homes for sale in Wayne County. of which 35.2% are within the Eugene city limits, 16% are in Springfield, 32% are aggregately in our smaller cities around Lane County, and 16, almost 17% are in unincorporated Lane County. So on its face, this would tell you that 51% of the houses that are currently for sale are within the Eugene Springfield boundary, within the metro boundary, and but nearly half are outside. So there is a clear role for county government specifically to try to do its part to facilitate the production of housing. And that's really, I think, is a pathway that's suggestive of what we can do to support our smaller cities. What we're learning and what we're hearing specifically from our smaller city managers, and we've talked to a couple so far, and we have plans to continue to reach out, is that they view housing as a co-equal component of their community and economic development aspirations. That housing is in fact viewed as a brake on economic development. The affordability of housing will compel people to look elsewhere when thinking about locating a business or where they would like to open business or advance commercial activities, and that we really do need to be thinking about infrastructure as a key component to facilitate more housing in some of our communities. We know that in our unincorporated rural communities, places like Pleasant Hill or Mapleton, where there is, in some instances, some degrees of infrastructure that is underserved, or where infrastructure is lacking, we can't do things like site childcare facilities because of the zoning overlay pieces. So this is really integral to our ability to be able to advance the quality of life and really kind of ensure that housing becomes more affordable. So I grant you that this is a snapshot in time. It's apropos of nothing other than we certainly have a role in what we can do. Now, I think that one of the kind of key components is I have really tried to wrap my head around our affordable housing challenge is really kind of, I'm grateful to Josh Lehner, an economist with state government, who specifically in the Office of Economic Analysis has been doing a lot of work and has been really trying to dive into helping us all understand specifically what's happening, what the dynamics are happening with the demographics and what's driving the housing market. So these slides and the two that follow this one, Mr. Lehner used to present to the Oregon House Committee on Housing to really kind of look specifically at the spread of the kind of missing housing, right? The 110 statewide that is characterized as underproduced, and how that splits out according to the Eco Northwest analysis across price points and income levels. And of course, we know our number is 16,000 housing units that we need to produce over the next 5 years. And the analysis from Eco Northwest gives us a sense of what that looks like in terms of the price points very specifically. So Mr. Lehner's research is suggesting some interesting kind of dynamics within demography, that the relative rate of new household formation accelerated during the pandemic, that they are accelerated at a rate faster than new housing units came available. So specifically, just that relative rate from a statewide perspective is we saw an increase of nearly 25,000 new a lack of 25,000 new housing units to make up for the demand. So we had 53,000 new households formed and only 28,500 housing units become available during that period of time. So the challenge is accelerating, and we see in the graphic on the right how that disaggregates down to our metro area, Eugene, our largest city.
Can you clarify what new households formed means? Is that just people moving here? What does that really mean?
It is people coming together to form new households, multifamily households, or people households, right? So these would be marriages, these would be domestic partnerships, these would be people coming together specifically to establish, as well as people who are coming here to reside.
So it's not necessarily influx, it's people who already lived here and reorganized our
That's-
living
that's
situation, as
exactly
well
right.
as people who are moving in.
That is
from other
correct. So it
communities.
might be individuals who may have shared a room as a roommate with others, right? Who then formed a commitment and decided that they wanted a place of their own. So we have these pressures that are really kind of a demographic issue that we're coping with. And, you know, when we look specifically at our own housing production, so as we kind of drill into that regional needs assessment, we know, and we've discussed the number of 16,403 housing units are missing here in Wayne County and are projected to be. So over the next 5 years, if we were to close that gap, we're going to need to produce 3,280 new units a year.
The extra land. Okay.
Indeed. So as we look specifically at the capacity within the actual production and the data that we have available to us, in 2021, we issued 1,930 new permits for housing units, and that's across all municipalities and the county and in Wayne County for new units. In 2020, the pandemic year, that number was 1,180. In 2019, the year before the pandemic, that was just 956 new units. Going back to 2018, 1,243. So you see that on average for the last 5 years, we're generating about a third of the units that we need specifically for the process. And we do need to build that capacity. So Chair Farr, as you note, specifically, we absolutely have to increase the land that's available, and then we have to turn that land into buildable lots. That is a key piece of the process. We need to ensure that that land is served by infrastructure. And this, as I noted, it was kind of the key lesson in my mind from Blue River and the rural kind of community planning project that particularly DLCD is doing to support us in Blue River is really a template for what we can do in some of our other unincorporated areas. I see this as being a critical piece of learning for us. Specifically, we have workforce considerations as well. So Dr. Lehner presented this graphic to the House Housing Committee last month as well that suggests, interestingly, we need a significant number of construction workers in Oregon to be able to actually address this shortage. So according to his calculations, we're about 13,000 short. And the residential housing market pays less than the commercial construction market, right? So this is a challenge with a fairly tight labor force as we've gone into this. And we will need to, as you see from a capacity perspective, Dr. Lehner's modeling also suggests that we need somewhere around 400 to 500 new planners across state and local government in Oregon in order to generate the sufficient number of capacity needed as well. So his modeling suggested about 0.04 to 0.05 FTE per housing start, really to kind of just think about what we need to do to add capacity to the system. So finally, I think another piece that we need to be thinking about is specifically what we're doing within our own processes. So just in sitting down with our land management division, I was very curious to understand. So this is the language that currently exists, Goal 10 within our comp plan. For Goal 10 is the housing under Oregon's planning laws. And specifically, the current language is for Goal 10, the adopted Wayne County Housing Plan is a special function plan concerned with Goal 10 requirements containing a number of policy statements specifying the county's position toward these requirements. The 1978 housing plan as amended, and I won't go further, but that's our Goal 10. And that's, we ask here, because I couldn't find the 1978, he was quite nice and of course helpful in providing all of the data that they have. That's it. That's the Affordable Housing Action Plan from 1978. And interestingly, there's similar kinds of strategies in this document, you might imagine. Begin a new program of land banking sites for lower income housing. This is in 1978. Consider using currently owned county land for new construction or subsidized housing. Review the consultant study now being done to determine the impact of our land development regulations on the cost of land and housing and take necessary action. Continue to meet local labor unions and community college staff to begin a pre-apprenticeship program that would result in a no labor cost lower income housing. So obviously, this work was prepared and brought forward and approved by a prior board and incorporated and enshrined. And what we learned in the House Housing Committee last month from a presentation from a Mr. Sean Edging of the Department of Land and Conservation Development is that the way that the agency has instructed local governments to calculate Goal 10 housing needs is flawed, deeply flawed, and it's coming up with the wrong number. And it's been an undercount for some time. So this is something that DLCD is bringing forward for consideration in the next legislative session. They have put forward, and it will await what the actual filed bill looks like, but specifically what we understand DLCD to be proposing are a host of changes specifically for that Goal 10 calculation. Some changes in the urban growth boundary expansion for affordable housing that would kind of streamline that process and not require a comp plan amendment. There's also the agency, I believe, is somewhat controversially proposing that state government, DLCD, would set housing production targets for cities over 10,000 in population. So we know that Eugene has already begun to, and Springfield and Cottage Grove are the three cities in Wayne County that currently are over 10,000 in population, and all three of them are working in this direction. Florence is just shy at 9,500, but they're already starting to lean into this work as well to begin to think about if this falls through. Now, we understand some city governments may not want to have state governments setting housing production targets, so we'll have to wait and see what happens within the legislature. I would be keen to understand your minds on this point specifically. We know that the Oregon Housing and Community Services has proposed just over $500 million in their legislative budget request for the next biennium to support affordable housing. But some of our work here locally is somewhat hung up on specifically some local limits of cash that is available. We've essentially almost nearly expended our private activity bond proceeds within Oregon, which enables us to partake of federal tax credit dollars for affordable housing. And this is above my level of expertise, but I'm told we have 4% and 9% low-income housing tax credits that have different requirements, percentage requirements. And for the 4% in particular, 50% of the project has to be funded by private activity bonds. There is hope that we could leverage that down to 25%, and this is the issue across that would help. And it sounds as if some action may be taken in the remaining time of this current session of Congress after they reconvene after the election. So we're hopeful that that would happen. If that doesn't happen, the Oregon Housing and Community Services has indicated that they're going to have a holiday here shortly in which they're not going to be able to provide tax credit funding. So I started with the interest rates, and I'm told that these tax credit bonds become, the appetite for these pick up quite substantially as interest rates go up. So this is really kind of a means through which our low and limited income housing developers can really kind of move that forward during this period of time. So obviously our work to continue to sharpen our focus on the state and federal advocacy on this issue will be critically important as we move forward. as we focus on reducing other barriers beyond what would happen within the advocacy domain, is really kind of continuing to invest in our own planning capacity, as this board has done. Absent a wholesale reset of state land use law, which I think is incredibly unlikely. I've learned a great deal talking to our land management division staff, and they're very aware of the incredible amount of work that is needed there. There's clear capacity constraints in their ability to do everything that's on their plate. I think in the short term, we can see some partnerships with our friends at the Department of Land and Conservation Development, who I think are clearly interested in working, particularly through regional solutions, to help us move some very short-term issues. We've been advised that the city of Creswell, because of sewerage capacity constraints, are already being advised by the DEQ that a housing moratorium may in fact be in effect there, and talking to the planners there, it could be 5 to 7 years that they would be offline and able to add new housing to that system. So working collaboratively with others in state government who are working to try to address some of our shortages, I think is a key strategy here. We're learning from our affordable housing developers specifically that sources of state and local funding really are limited. They really have to draw money from other places. They shared that when they are in conversation with the business community perceives that there is a lot of money here. They confuse the amount of money going into the unhoused services sector as dollars available for affordable housing development, and thus are really that perception that there's a lot of money here. Why aren't we seeing housing being built? It's because it's going for other very vital services, and really trying to help people understand what that looks like. The surplus land is useful, and within our current affordable housing plan, we talk about county-owned land, we talk about other public sector land that is available to us, and Karin Knudsen, who helped us with this particular strategy, said it best when she said, "Steve, county government has to think like a developer when we're thinking about this public land," and we do. We have to do a better job of that, and that's a piece that we can do. We've really dug in with our facilities team. The current assessor and the assessor-elect were very kind in helping us understand how properties come into county ownership for those that fail to pay their property taxes, and what that process looks like in terms of disposing with those dollars. And then finally, just as we continue to work with our city managers around so outside of Eugene, Springfield, we have a lot of work to do with Eugene and Springfield within our urban growth boundary. And there, our primary strategy, I think, is thinking like a developer with the lands that we have access to and can control. But outside, it's really trying to work with our smaller cities within those teams, adding our capacity and coupling our community and economic development and housing work in partnership with rural Wayne County in our smaller cities to really try to impact. So just that snapshot of the kind of geography of the current real estate market suggests that we could have a notable impact with focused effort there. But we have to do things to increase our capacity to access funding for infrastructure investment. To that end, we've begun to really kind of understand what it takes to reestablish our ability to administer the community development block grant process and complete all of the steps for making a first draw. So it is my goal specifically that we have our first application approved in 2023 to begin the process of drawing in an additional source of funds that we can invest in the infrastructure that will grow our housing base. So, Chair Farr, that is my update and presentation to you today.
Well, that was excellent, Steve, particularly the part where you talk about our current 1978 as amended plan. So let's open it for discussion. Questions for Mr. Adams? We'll begin with Commissioner Buck, who has a little bit of real estate background.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's pretty clear that the need exists and it continues to grow. by multitudes of circumstances, and the numbers that we come up with each year, especially from an economic development standpoint, continue to be understated. And we know other things are going to happen. There's going to be different things going on in the world and within intrastate activity that's going to probably bump up the need. And so those counts that you present aren't a surprise. I expect those numbers to continue to go up over the years as we think of other external issues that continue to plague the lack of development of housing in our area. When you made a comment about thinking like a developer, I think we have to be clear what kind of developer we're talking about. I come from a lens of a nonprofit social service agency developer. I did that for years. And so there's a specific target of individuals and a specific set of services that come along with that kind of development that's very different than maybe your for-profit single family housing or other multifamily housing. And it is something that I think as a county we need to be clear about. Who are we targeting? Which kind of development, if that's the lens that we want to use in order to expand housing in our area? Because going after different kinds of money requires you to determine which developer needs you're going to really need. The tax credit program, which I've been a part of in multiple developments, is a very expensive way in which to increase the affordable housing supply in Oregon. It gives a ton of money to lawyers, but it was the one way the federal government could negotiate with states in order to advance housing that was a public-private partnership everybody could agree on. But it's not the most efficient way in order to increase resources for affordable housing, but it's what we've got from a federal standpoint. I wish Congress could address that more, but there are other ways in which as a state we could probably bring up resources that are not so expensive on the front end. But it's what we have as a government to deal with if you want any large chunk of money to be able to utilize. It's been a long time consternation of mine is that is what we're forced to work with in certain affordable housing developments. And it could be so easily changed if there was the political will to do it. I really like the idea of us land banking, but I don't see us actually doing it. And it's shocking that they said it in 1978, but we haven't ever had a chance to put money aside. I don't know where our ARPA money balance is looking today, but whenever we get additional resources like that, that's a prime opportunity to put it in the side in land bank, not only for affordable housing, but for other resources the county may or may not need. We've been developing a lot of capital construction projects here lately. We run out of space all the time, and it could serve a dual purpose. Other than that, I actually have a question. I had to get that off my chest. The question is, we no longer have a dedicated person assigned to specifically the Affordable Housing Action Plan, and there's been some reorganization. Can you speak to that?
Indeed, Chair Farr and Commissioner Bach, thank you so much for the excellent points. Specifically, we've been working with Health and Human Services to develop a way forward for how to ensure that we provide adequate staffing for the Affordable Housing Action Plan, which despite the name, includes activity across all of the income spectrums, right? It's the broader spectrum of housing that is needed in addition to the 40% or so that is specifically really for 80% of AMI and below. And we know that that's the specific kind of breakout. We've decided not to divorce that or have that housing piece here in the policy division, but rather to have that staffing really kind of bridge the human services division within health and human services specifically. So Director Gray and I have been working with the team there to determine how best to move that forward. We'll have additional details to share with the board coming up in short order. But in this forum, specifically, we have agreement on how we're going to kind of bring the expertise of that shop to bear, particularly with a focus on how that connects to the specific needs at the lowest spectrum of the income. Housing needs together with the broader kind of components of community and economic development that exist within the policy division.
Look forward to that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Buck. Further discussion, Vice Chair Trieger? I see no hands, then you're in danger of me going. There's a hand. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. You know, it's all an interesting discussion, but it's a lot of ground we've covered many times before. You know, what's fascinating to me is there is this, you know, from 1978 and onward, this discussion of trying to make our regulation of the industry less burdensome. And all we've done since 1978 is wildly burden the industry with governmental constraints and governmental costs. And, you know, in another stunning example of the state can't do any new program correctly, we finally got ADUs and RR over 2 acres through the legislature, only to have it tied to these wildfire risk maps, which the state completely messed up developing to the point where they had to pull them back. And now they're telling us it might be another year before we see those maps, which will allow us to start issuing permits for ADUs in our zoning to add to our housing stock. We have got to do better when it comes to that. And I really have to appreciate the portion of the report that talked about the need for staff to push some of these permits through. Because, you know, I've mentioned this before, one of the number one constituent contacts I get is, I can't get my permit, or I can't get a straight answer, or I'm having a problem getting something inspected. It has something to do with the process of land use and building permits. It is number one contact from a constituent. You know, so that's just, we need to do better. And part of that is staff. And I will appreciate the board's support for additional staff in our land management department. And I do appreciate the board's use of some video lottery funding this past year to supplement land management's budget. But we have to really, as a state and as a county and other jurisdictions, really think about how we regulate the construction of housing. And if there's a way we can do that in a way that makes it easier, rather than putting roadblocks, you know, even a statewide roadblock of a rent control bill that is actually just depress the investment in multifamily projects statewide. So, you know, we got to get out of our own way in a lot of ways. And, you know, land banking's great, and, you know, we can play the developer, but, you know, frankly, we can't be as efficient. And examples like the wildfire risk maps is just one way a government can't be efficient. The most efficient constructor of housing units is going to be the private sector if we can turn them loose and get out of their way.
Thank you, Commissioner Bozovich, for the discussion. Vice Chair Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Just a question when you talk about working with the cities, I mean, obviously we looked at some of the proportions. Do you have any specific ideas for options for what that looks like? There are 2 properties in particular in my district that are just now being developed in ways that, to me, they are 2 prime locations for multifamily housing. One is the corner of 7th and Polk. And as I understand it, it's going to be yet another 7-Eleven convenience store and gas station. Not sure we need that. I'm sure we need multifamily housing. And there it is, right on a transit corridor with an MX stop right out in front, abuts onto a residential neighborhood of older homes. And the other is the corner of 30th and Hilliard. There used to be a bank. It was raised, and my understanding is now a dental office is going in. Again, sure, a dental office, but there it is on a prime transit corridor across the street from a park with a bike path, a full service grocer on the other corner, just down the hill from Lane Community College. These are just two examples to me of properties that would have been prime for retail on the bottom, multi-units on the top. And of course, that's not our decision. But do you have any thoughts about what those examples are of how we work with our cities to get out of our own way, as Commissioner Bozovich said, or help them do so?
Well, Commissioner Farr and Commissioner Trigger, it is a good question. And I think certainly I think what is emerging in the limited conversations that we've had thus far with our smaller cities is really just trying to understand the challenges and issues that they're coping with. I think a consistent theme is a lack of capacity that they have. Certainly as in really trying to understand the constraints and then creative thought. Really, I mean, the conversation with our colleagues at the city of Creswell, just talking to that planner who reached out saying, I have a specific problem. And the question that came into us was, can you help us think about how to access funding for a wastewater treatment facility? So that, and then kind of laid out the problem. And so, of course, that kind of opening question opens a whole host of other potential pathways of trying to solve that problem. So I think that is one way in which we can work with our cities, is really thinking about, Ms. Cusimano, who is our current community and economic development manager, is terrific in terms of her relationship building with our small cities and developing the needs and wants that they are articulating. So we're hearing increasingly that their housing needs and their community economic development needs are linked, very, very tightly coupled. So ensuring that those conversations are more holistic and thinking about what those community economic development needs are in service to really facilitating housing. I think beyond that, it really is just bringing whatever additional capacity that we can, remain focused on solutions, do what we can do, and ensure that we're using our connections and the considerable power that our staffing that we have vis-a-vis many of our local jurisdictions who have just one individual thinking about these these issues, or maybe not even a whole person thinking about these issues on a day in, day out basis. I think that through our advocacy efforts, our work with our congressional delegation, our work with our legislative delegation as well to try to facilitate that. But that kind of focus, I think the conversation with our larger metro city partners is different. And I think really trying to understand where they are going. They certainly have capacity, and in some instances more capacity than we do, in order to be able to shape the direction. We know that our partners with the city of Eugene, for instance, are just as we've sat down and the council recently passed a housing production pipeline project, as they have kind of labeled it. We've dug in, we're learning more. The staff has asked us to kind of hold for a moment because they're focused on some other issues, but within, certainly within the next month or two, we anticipate additional conversations with the city to understand what they're doing.
Thank you.
Okay. Steve, Mr. Adams, this is one of the best presentations I've seen, because you are beginning to acquiesce to the need that we have and the ways that we can address it. And the first thing that we have to be honest about is that not all jurisdictions and all bodies have the same urgency that we are now developing regarding providing housing. I was a city councilor for 10 years. In 1995, we had a land bank. The last chunk of land from that land bank was utilized about almost 10 years ago now on what is now Bascom Village. That was from the city of Eugene's land bank. But there's no place to grab land to bank. And if the land does become available to grab for banking, you see the prices of the land. The prices of housing, the houses, is reflected in the land that they're built on also. It's out of sight to put that land in banking. So we need to make certain that find a way to make certain that we all have the same clear focus on how we can look to the future rather than look to the past. The fact that we're laughing about the 1978 plan, which is being amendments to it are being used to this day. That's not really a laughing matter because that is rife throughout jurisdictions. They stick to decisions that were made at a point in time and project those decisions into the future long past the time that they are valid. I'll give you another example of that. In 2009, we sat down. It was initially a very large group, about 75 people, called Envision Eugene. And that group got smaller and smaller and smaller, and it went on for years and years and years and years. Envision Eugene continued to meet until smaller groups met to make some of the final decisions that came out of Envision Eugene. Well, in about 2015, they finally decided we don't need any more land outside the existing UGB for either commercial or residential. And a part of the issue with the 7-Elevens on corners is that's a part of our commercial land inventory that cannot be really interfered with, or you would lose the balance that was achieved through the projections that came from Envision Eugene. So here we are now, 7 years after Envision Eugene was published, still holding on to that antiquated concept that we don't need to re-envision what the land supply is and the different types of land supply. We're just now putting together the pieces that were what was determined in Envision Eugene that we needed for the city of Eugene, and that was more industrial land outside of the more 50+ acre lots of land. Well, we're getting those in place right now, but we're still doing nothing about residential and the associated commercial, because the 7-Eleven and the smaller stores are really neighborhood stores for the residences that are built in that particular neighborhood. We lose track of it, and we adhere to antiquated beliefs as to how much land we have and what it takes to move forward. We need to continually be moving forward. And Mr. Adams, your presentation today is a part of that step forward, acknowledging that we are in a world of hurt in terms of housing the people who are living here and need to live here and want to live here. And we wring our hands about the expanding homelessness. The expanding housing insecurity is even more frightening. And when you take into account that every year, Willamette High School, Eugene area high schools graduate someplace in the neighborhood of 2,500 kids every year, year in, year out, year in, year out, 2,500 more young Eugenians looking for a place to be. Some of them end up staying with their parents, a lot of them leave town. A lot of them go to college, a lot of them team up and live in multiple housing units, but no small number of them want to live in the place that they were born. And they want to live close to where their parents and their families and their support system. That number is not going to get smaller. So the numbers that we're looking at today are tiny compared to what we're going to be looking at 10 years from now if we don't begin to really make some conscious decisions regarding how we can work together to solve the problem. And getting everybody reading from the same page is essential. You know, we can talk about means to do it. We can talk about different housing types. Of course, we have to talk about different housing types. We have to talk about minor adjustments to the urban growth boundary, for instance, to allow low-income housing adjacent to outside of existing urban growth boundary. We have to do that, but that's only a small part of the solution. The solution is the political will for jurisdictions to get together and understand that we have to do it. If we don't do that, we'll continue to throw the brakes on wherever we can, because it's really, really easy to slow things down. It's ridiculously easy for anybody at any number of desks or any number of levels to slow it down. But if we're not working together in facilitation of housing, it's simply not going to happen. I'm looking at your presentation today, Steve, as really a bright point, because you put out some numbers and some statements today that we need to build our future on. We can no longer look in the past and trust the analysis that we've been given from past jurisdictions, past governments, and past analyses. We have to look to the future, the new paradigm that we see in front of us. And the fact is, I don't think there's anybody here who denies climate refugeeism, for instance. Well, what's going to happen here? Because this is going to be desirable when people can't live in Southern California or the Arizona desert anymore. So that's going to be happening. Our organic stock of new houses needed is going to continue to happen. We're going to have people move from Ohio and want to live here because it's a better place to live. It's going to happen. And if we don't all work together, and I'm not prescribing any solutions at this time, or I'm not going to wring my hands over the things that we've done, we have to develop the political will to make things happen in a way that facilitates building housing at every single level. That's just a very general statement, but once again, this is the third time I've said it. I view your presentation today as a bright point, as a really an indication that we are beginning to acknowledge that we need to do something. We need to do it together, and that the DLCD is saying, "Oh well, we had people working on the wrong model." That's a huge step to have them say that they had people working on the wrong model, because there are those among us who knew that, but they wouldn't believe it. That's all I'm going to say about it at this point in time. But I think we have a lot of work ahead of us. And as we move into the new year, we'll have new city council, we'll have new boards of commissioners, and we'll have new policymaking boards where we have to get together and make certain that we understand the need, not how much we want to conserve what we have, but how much we need. We have a responsibility to provide what is needed, if only for the people who are organically living in our local area. So that's once again, just a very broad statement. I'm not going to pick apart what the city of Eugene does. You said we all kind of smiled when you said some cities do things differently to other cities. Well, yeah, of course they do. And if you look at the way Springfield addressed the rules and new ability for ADUs compared to the way the city of Eugene did. City of Springfield facilitated, city of Eugene hit the brakes and said, well, we got to make sure we have the regulations tight on this. And we also have strong input from neighborhood groups that don't want it in their neighborhood. So how do we make everybody look on the same page, Steve? That's your task. And we have, let's see, 2 hours. So please go ahead. Commissioner Buck.
I just forgot to mention one thing, and I spoke earlier, and I think this is probably the largest nugget of information that I got out of the material that you attached to this agenda item, which was the CDBG entitlement status. And I think that will be a game changer for resources for us in order to proceed with a lot of our goals. And I didn't want us to pass by that, because that is a huge element of what you presented and something that hadn't been pulled forward to us previously, at least to my knowledge. And I wanted to make sure that that was stated.
And, thank you for that, because you did state a number of different avenues and possibilities to make it easier to build based on revenue sources, et cetera. But the revenue, no matter how much money you give us, we're not going to build if we don't have the will to build. And right now, I can categorically say we do not have the will to build. And that's what we need to address. So, any further discussion? Mr. Adams, thank you. Keep up this good work. 6 months now.
Indeed.
It seems like 5 years, but or it seems
Good
like
way, in a good
in
way.
a good way. Exactly. I look at the body of work that's been amassed in that 6 months, and it is both impressive and formidable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then with that, on that bright note, and the bright note is, as I said, Mr. Mokrajski, the presentation that Mr. Adams just gave to us, I look at it as a coffee table book for us to keep track of, keep looking back on. We'll move down the agenda to item 13B, which is a discussion, an update on equity work within and across all Lane County departments. This will be good. Mr. Mokrajski.
Thank you, Chair. And with us today, we have Judy Williams from County Administration and Corey Rodley from our equity program. Of course, Latife Amato, our equity manager, is on maternity leave. And we're really pleased to hear from Corey today, filling in for Latife and representing our equity program. Since this is, I think you all know Corey, and certainly Corey has an evening gig too, but here in her role with Lane County, this is your first presentation to the board, is it not?
It is.
On behalf of the equity program. So I think, Judy, do you want to do a little introduction?
Sure, I would love to. Thank you, Steve.
Before you do, we can all thank Latife for the 2 Tootsie Rolls we
Yes.
enjoyed yesterday.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Commissioners, Chair Farr. Good afternoon, Judy Williams, Strategy and Integration Manager, and my role, as Steve mentioned, as Latife has been out, is just kind of temporarily helping to support the equity program, support Corey, although she doesn't need that support. It's just the first few months on the job. So it's been 4 months and a few days. And we're just thrilled to have Corey here at Lane County. She just has really stepped right in from day one and really listened to departments, gathered information, and just really just helping to guide them through the process of utilizing the equity lens. And so we're really excited to have Corey with us here today. She does bring a wealth of knowledge, experience, information from her background with nonprofit management experience, government experience, community service, and as Steve mentioned, elected council for City of Springfield. So that and Corey's going to be talking through some of the slides, laying a little bit about the foundation leading up to today. And while this is her first presentation to you as a staff member, she has been in that role as a volunteer and chair of the Equity and Access Advisory Board. So it's been exciting to kind of see that full circle, being a part of the community, several community members, but Corey rolling up her sleeves to really delve into what things should look like here at Lane County as we were looking at our equity, as we've referred to it as Equity 1.0 and the process to really kind of build the framework of what we need here at the county. So she's really stepped in at that time, and it's exciting to have her here and helping us at Lane County now see it forward. So with that, I will try and help run the slides if that's helpful. You walk through the.
Thank you, Ms. Williams, and welcome, Ms. Rodley.
Thank you. No
Councilor Rodley.
pressure. Oh, my word. And you covered some of the things I was going to say that it has been 4 months that I keep referring to it as being inside the county. Because I have been before this board, which felt a lot easier when I wasn't like representing an entire organization. I was just like here to be like, do better. And I'm really proud to have been part of the inaugural Equity and Access Advisory Board and, co-chaired that for a period. And I just want to say that we're going to kind of do an update because I know it's been a while. And so that was one of the reasons we wanted to sort of do a little grounding because over the past 6 years, so much work has been done to establish this effort. And I just want to call out, Mo Young as the creator of the equity program helped to lay a strong foundation. And I have really been appreciating the context and the history and just the deep understanding of how to do things within county government that Judy has been bringing to this work. It's been fantastic to work with her in this way. And she was part of the initial GARE cohort, so has been a part of this work too for several years. And as the county administrator mentioned, we have Latifah Amato, who's bringing so much new energy and some new approaches to these ongoing efforts. And there are many champions that you may or may not know throughout the organization that have dug in to really normalize and operationalize and are bringing this kind of equity and inclusion into how we do the work every day. And that's part of what we're going to kind of lean into is kind of show the ways that this is really showing up throughout the organization, since that was a goal, was to get to where we move from kind of an understanding of why to reinforcing that why and get to the goal of it, or get to operationalizing it. So we sort of called it 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And I'm not going to go, this is what happens when an English major does a PowerPoint. You end up with a whole lot of text. So it's there for you all to kind of look at. And I'm just going to highlight some of it as I move through it. And just the Equity 1.0, there was a lot of work that was done in the community, as some folks who were here remember, to just sort of identify what would it look like if the county got really leaned into doing this work. And some of the top things were to improve recruitment and retention and advancement, particularly for people who have marginalized experiences or people of color. And then, establishing a culture that's asking tough questions, that understands what sort of diversity, equity, inclusion, and now we've expanded that to be, accessibility and belonging, and really continuing to evolve our understanding of what that means, and gets to the real issues by addressing what's really going on and to institutionalize this equity work as we continue to evolve with it. And even though it wasn't one of the top priorities, we just wanted to say that the creation of the Equity Department and the Equity and Access Advisory Board in 2017 were just such key pieces to starting to build this work. And because of that, then there was a lot of the work that was done by this body there were board orders and resolutions for around the Black Lives Matter movement, acknowledging racism as a public health crisis, to acknowledge the destruction of Lane County's first Black neighborhood, and start to just really wrestle with where we've come from and what does government do about that, particularly county government. So in asking those tough questions, a lot of that was just building the capacity to do that. And that's ongoing work to just continually be building the capacity to reflect and to respond and to act and to figure out what it is we need to do with what we know and what we don't know. And then building the confidence and the familiarity with how do we operationalize equity? What does that mean? And how does everybody do it, from Public Works to the Sheriff's Department to Health and Human Services? And initially, because I know y'all were here for that, initially folks are like, what does that have to do with me? But we're getting to a place where people are starting to understand what that has to do with their work, and how that affects how we're doing the work of improving lives in the county. So as we move into the next levels, what we know we need to expand is our understanding through improved data. So that's been a big piece of thinking about how does data inform the decisions that we're making in the equity work. For me, a lot of that is just using data to really understand what we're talking about. We tend to talk anecdotally, or we will tell stories about who we think is here or who we think is affected in what ways. And now we have an opportunity to say, well, let's really understand. We may have an understanding of what it looked like in 1978, but what does it look like now? So I think that that embracing, exploring, and improving the data analytics, as well as building that internal department and those equity committees and the internal understanding of how it's showing up, is a key place in where we've come so far. So I love this because it just reminds us that this work is also not linear. And yet we can still stay really focused on ensuring that we're sustaining the work. And that's the challenge. And because it can be not linear, people can be like, well, what we used to say this, and now we say this, and what's happening here and there. And just, this is a reminder of all the ways that we over and over again are continuing to provide training, to continuing to communicate throughout the organization why this is important, celebrating successes, which today is a day to do a little bit of that. Bringing up the results, continuing to cultivate new champions. This is something we started to talk about a lot. It's like, how is it time for the next cohort to go through the GARE workshop? It's time to continue to build champions so that folks can share in the work, and that's how it really becomes embedded. So I wanted to just sort of talk about what that operationalizing looks like, because working to normalize and operationalize equity was a big part of the initial racial equity plan, the 21-22 racial equity plan. And with it, there's also a lot of challenges. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that have popped up in terms of what we're learning as we do this, and learning how to use systems, the systems we know, to work within a structure that is government, to do work that was not necessary, or to create environments and do work that was not necessarily meant for all of us to be in. These systems weren't created for all of us to be here. And now we're here trying to shift those structures and figure out, how do we create those cultures of belonging? How do we make sure that everybody can come to work and do really great work in a system that maybe was not initially meant for them to be here? So education and training for staff is ongoing, and it helps to ground us in all of this value of inclusion and belonging. And you'll see from the list, that the importance of the strategic plan and the equity plan, and embedding the work throughout all of the work that everyone's doing. And while we're doing that, we're also connecting with others who are doing this work throughout the country, throughout the nation, and throughout, folks who are doing it throughout the state as we work. And we're also working in communities to include and reflect and build these authentic relationships. So it just becomes this constant, like we're building it together as we go. And I just wanted to highlight for the sort of tools that the equity, inclusion, and access have been intentionally woven throughout the strategic plan. And it's been really great to work with Judy because that's a big part of her work to kind of look at all of the ways that's in there. And it's helping to sort of guide folks as to, oh, wait, we're supposed to, we have to stop, wait, we need to bring this toolkit alongside the multi-use facility planning. We need to bring this along because we've said this is a piece of what we're going to do. So I wanted to just sort of sit here for a little bit because I think one of the board orders, and I can't remember which one, said, we're gonna look at where we mess up. We're going to constantly be evaluating what's happening so that we continue to adapt. And so some of the things that have come up and that we're learning, some of you may recall the countywide listening sessions that were done. I think the majority of them happened during COVID because they were set up to go and then we went into COVID. And some of the themes that, and I know that there's been some reporting about that, but some of the themes that emerged from community were around, education, accountability, transparency, representation, access. And so we get to wrestle with what those mean in different parts of the work that we do. And we have all of that information that we collected from those listening sessions to go back and say, okay, this is what people meant. And community members help to identify the ways that county government can both help and hinder. And both of those are constantly helpful. It's helpful to know where are the barriers. And that's one of the capacities as I've been getting to know my colleagues at the county. People are really learning how to ask that. What are the barriers to this work that I'm doing? What's getting in the way of us being able to really get vaccines out to all of the communities? We've started to really build our capacity for that. And yet there's still a lot more work to do to educate staff and partners on why we have made racial equity and inclusion and accessibility and belonging a priority. And this has been coming up in my 4 months at the county, which has been really helpful for me now being on the inside, because from the outside, you're like, why do these things? Go do these things. And now to see, we need to, especially there's been a lot of staff turnover. There's been, this pressure to do lots of work and lots of great work, but we need to continually sort of slow it down enough to remind people, this is why this is important. This is why it's in the plan and the strategic plan. And this is why it's, why we're all continuing to try to evolve on this. And urgency gets in the way of it. Urgency is one of the tenets of white supremacy. And that sense of earnesty often keeps us from slowing down to make sure we're being inclusive, make sure we're addressing barriers, make sure we're bringing folks along so that they can do their best work through this lens. And Judy and I have had some conversations about this, working to ensure that as we work through the plans, we've got our strategic plan and departments have plans, and just making sure that those align and that the work plans and the goals reflect those equity measures in the strategic plan, because that's what's going to improve the outcomes and ensure that we have that meaningful and lasting change, as if everybody sees where they fit into that. So, and I'm not going to read all of these, but these are just some of the ways that, the objectives from the 2022-24 Lane County Strategic Plan that we're going to gain perspective from people with the highest needs and the highest users of the system. We're going to work to address racial disparities in our adult and juvenile justice system. So we've got these embedded in there. We're going to focus on rural communities. And so even as people are saying, okay, why? This is, a lot of these are really hard to argue with, right? It's like, yeah, we're going to focus on rural communities by enhancing outreach. Yes, we're going to work to, establish a culture of organizational learning. So these are ways that I really appreciate, because this was something that happened since my leaving the Equity and Access Advisory Board and coming to the inside of the county, of seeing this progress in terms of, oh yeah, this is how we're doing it. We're going to use this equity lens and we're going to bring it alongside. So I also just, as I've been going out and chatting with folks and trying to get to know my colleagues, and part of what I've been asked to do is to help people to understand the equity lens and to understand the equity lens toolkit. And what I was finding as we're like, we need to pilot these projects, I was finding people have already been piloting projects. Departments are already have been working to do this. And so I just wanted you all to have just a little collection of a few things that I think are kind of fun and unexpected, because I think when we think of equity work, sometimes we think of trainings or we think of these things that are not necessarily the work. And, you know, this year, the assessment and taxation, the statements that went out, the tax statements, they used the equity toolkit to think about what does this document look like? Is it accessible? How many people, how do we actually address the problems that we see? Like, how do we cut down on people feeling like they need to call us or come into the office? Or how do we address this in a way that's going to be more accessible for people? And so that's a perfect use of that equity lens. And that's what it means to just start to build that capacity to say, how do we do this better? I was excited to find that the economic development has created their own equity tool using the equity lens to say, this is how we're going to evaluate funding projects, and have dug into like, what does this look like in our work? The sheriff's office with the integration of STOP. And I was like, I have to write this down. Statistical transparency of policing, which is a way of collecting data, demographic data, when you stop folks so that we can track, are some people being stopped more often than other people being stopped? And it goes into the state database, and they're able to sort of hold ourselves accountable and say, what's happening here, and all of that good stuff. So there's just a few more pages of things that is showing up in. I know you all know, because Human Resources reports to you, that they've dug in really hard about how do we increase recruitment and retention. Employee resource groups, which the county has, which is an opportunity for people, LGBTQ plus folks like myself, to get together, or folks who have kiddos can get together, people of color. There's some employee resource groups to help to sort of bolster that sense of belonging so that you can meet other folks and say, how's it going for you? And how can we kind of share ideas and get to know each other's? So a few of the other things, and you've seen some of these, you saw the recovery evaluation for the Holiday Farm Fire, where they definitely brought equity along, an equity lens along to talking about what that recovery looked like. So this is just to give you all something to just sort of sit down if you're like, hey, or if somebody comes and says, what even does an equity lens mean? You say, oh, what it means is we have created this tool so that we can ask ourselves all of these questions to help us to be more inclusive, to help us to make sure we're not leaving anybody out, to make sure we're not making a decision that's going to affect or harm someone more than someone else. So this equity lens toolkit is being intentionally used throughout the organization. Y'all got a copy of it in your packet, so you'll see it is big. And what I am telling people as I sort of noodle up in their business, you're probably not going to use the whole thing, and you're probably not going to use it forever. And the idea is that you know that you have a place to go to ask questions. We figure out what your project is that you're working at, or what your problem is that you're trying to solve. And we say, okay, where do we enter this? How do we think about it? Do you have enough different perspectives at the table to even start to talk about what your solution is? Is somebody else doing it? Things like that we can bring that toolkit along. Meanwhile, we're sort of collecting the feedback, because it's not going to stay the same. It's already changed and evolved. And as we build our capacity internally and people find out what works and what doesn't work, and hey, it'd be really helpful to have this, we can continually evolve the tools so that people have what they need to continue to feel confident doing it. So we are in the process of creating a new equity strategic plan. And like all things government is going through committees and groups of folks, which is something I love and many of us do. We love that process of like, who do we make sure gets to weigh in and bring all their brilliant decisions? So we've accomplished many of the objectives on the initial racial equity plan, and staff and leadership are engaging intentionally to evaluate what the next focus areas are. And COVID both accelerated and sidelined some of the initial goals. There was a lot of work around training and creating competencies, and then COVID kind of sidelined those a little bit. So those are coming back into like, where are we at with this? How do we build this into the next plan? And that draft plan is going to go through the internal equity core team, which is made up of people who went through that initial GARE cohort. So that core team is kind of working on this and anticipating that they will also be morphing into a different group, as a lot of those folks have been doing that work for several years, that we're ready to like bring in some new champions and folks to work on that. And the Equity and Education Committee, which is also a cross-organizational equity committee, is working on this. And then the draft plan will go to the new Equity and Access Advisory Board for final approval in the next year, is the plan. So because this was also kind of a board assignment, we wanted to talk a little bit about the committee and board processes. And Judy has been in the trenches with trying to bring the equity lens alongside of the kind of redistricting committee effort, and now with the charter review committee process. And there's been lessons learned, barriers identified, and analysis for kind of next steps. And I wanted to just I'm kind of going to toggle back and forth between this and the next slide, because while we have some, and Judy has come up and she can chat more about that after I talk about why it's going to be hard. There's some emerging challenges around committees and boards, because there's this inherent political nature for some of our boards and committee appointments. So to just come in over the top of that and say, okay, now we're going to apply equity, when it's sort of built in a sort of self-selection process, is a little bit of a challenge, and there's some tension there. So there's some need to kind of get really clear about what's the purpose, the structure, the scope of these boards and committees and commissions, and then to think about what are the time constraints on outreach, recruitment, appointments, and kind of get a shared understanding of what that diversity and diverse representation and inclusion is going to look like on those boards and committees. So it's, as I say, which is super colloquial, it's bigger than a bread box, but to this, and maybe Judy will talk to it, because she's the one who's like, here's some ideas that she's learned for what we could do next steps to help us start to dig into that. That's your.
Thank you, Corey. So I think going back to the board assignment, and I think where we left this was the board seeking staff ideas, recommendations, kind of thoughts moving forward. And I think, in particular was looking at representation, looking at diversity, looking at ways to weave in, how do we improve our process at many levels. And so, just kind of going quickly through some of the things that we learned in the redistricting committee process, which had a lot of really great pieces to it, with a independent redistricting committee. A lot of people on that committee, really felt like that was a great process, and it was a good thing to be a part of and experience. While we had the bylaws that were very clear on, we want a diverse committee, we'd like it to have, this purpose and so forth. We learned, the application materials that were submitted in order to get folks to join and apply didn't quite give people enough information to make those decisions and choices. And so learning from that, trying to apply that to like the charter review committee. And so anytime we have these opportunities with either vacancies on a committee or board, I think it would be helpful. We've talked about brainstorming ways to have those conversations, but looking at what we have available. Are there basic things like retooling the application materials so that we can gather that information, looking at the purpose of each committee, whether it's mandated, it's not mandated, it's advisory to who, really trying to think and look through not only the bylaws, but the purpose, and is that still applicable? Is there still, are there ways to weave in utilizing the equity lens as to trying to get at what are we trying to do with this body, and what are the ways in which we can build that when the time comes. And then, as you know, there's many committees, many boards for the county. So maybe just utilizing conversations with staff liaisons, conversations with department directors, with you as the board, onto, you know, what do we see where we have some wiggle room on some of these boards in order to weave that in, so that we can really address some of what we've heard over and over from the community on representation, you know, seeing themselves reflected in committees and boards throughout Lane County. So more conversations to come, but that was just one idea of how we can continue those conversations to try and get at one, our purpose to improve and constantly retool based on what we've learned, and two, to reflect the desire of the board assignment to related to the committee process. And that's one thing that and you'll touch on too. I think the Equity and Access Advisory Board is one of them, of before we just start and open up applications, here's a perfect time to take our time, do it right. Now is the time. There's nobody on it. So looking at bylaws, and that's what Corey and other of us are looking at too. What is the purpose? Is it still to have it reporting to the county administrator, or what does it need to look like? And what does the application material need to look like in order to try and achieve those? Or so there's just some of those things.
Yeah, I appreciate you leading into that, because that was one of the things that I did when I got here. Was I went and met with about 50%, a little bit more, of the Equity and Access Advisory Board members who were part of the last year of that board, because I went off of it when I was elected to council, and so I missed some of it. And so it was great to meet with those folks and to meet with some staff stakeholders who had been a part of it, or who had worked with them through some projects. And it was great to identify some themes and some challenges and opportunities. And one of them was towards the end that a lot of folks were feeling like there was a lack of clarity around what the work needed to look like now. And when we dug in and I look at where we've come from and what we're calling 1.0 and 2.0, that makes sense, right? You created something at the beginning to help to guide this and to help to create that kind of community buy-in and community sort of holding us accountable to create it. So it makes sense that now's the time, as we're also figuring out how to operationalize this work, to think of what's the best use of that and what's the best way to gather feedback in order to clarify the purpose. So we've been having some conversations about that. I've had some like middle of the night brilliant ideas of if I ruled the world, what I would do. And Judy's had some ideas. And so we're just starting to think about, well, what would that look like? And what's going to be the most useful way as we move forward with this? And the plan is still to start recruiting for a new advisory board in the winter, so that we could start in the spring and just keep moving forward with it. So that's what's happening there. And that is really my sort of overview of where we've been, where we are, some of the bumps, some of the opportunities. And I just want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions or provide comments or feedback or any of that good stuff.
Well, thank you for the presentation. And I'm looking to make certain that Commissioner Bozievich is with us. At this point, to the board, I'll open it up for questions or comments. That was a pretty lengthy presentation because there's a lot of ground that you covered. Oh my gosh. And in looking at, we have before us in our packet, the document, this is a type of day, the Lane County Equity Lens Toolkit. It goes into great detail
Yes.
and really pretty well. Did you write that?
No, from my understanding, and Judy can tell me if I'm lying, there was an internal committee that worked on the initial version of the Equity Lens Toolkit. And I think it was adapted from somewhere else.
believe Ottawa.
Yeah, it might say it on there.
Ottawa's listed, yeah.
And then I believe that when Latife joined earlier in the year, she went through and did an edit and made some changes to it. So this is Equity Lens 2.0 for Equity Work 3.0.
Well, it really reads well. And the reason I asked if you wrote it, because the structure of the paragraphs is a read. It's not a, document that you have to kind of study. You can read it almost like a novel, I mean, it really does, it speaks in terms that people understand very well. So congratulations on that. So to the board, questions or comments? Then we'll begin with, we're all looking back and forth. I'll start with Vice Chair Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm a fan, so I don't have to go into a lot of preamble, but I'm excited for the presentation and the conversation in a number of ways, but particularly around the role of committees more sort of writ large at the organization. But before I say a little more about that, I just want to quote a bumper sticker or a sticker that actually I think it was Mo Young, who you referenced earlier, who I first saw this wrapped around her water bottle, that said, "There's a difference between all are welcome here, and this was designed with you in mind." And so a lot of what I hear us working toward doing here is endeavoring to ensure that internally, as well as how we deliver services externally to the community, that we're designing those processes in an inclusive with everyone in mind, and that's a constant learning, because we don't know what we don't know yet. And that's where, leading into committees, it's incumbent on us to be approachable and accessible and have people know how and to whom they say, "I don't see my place here. I don't know. I have ideas, I have experiences, good or bad, and I don't even know who to." I mean, we all get that. We get voicemails and emails saying, "I don't know who to talk to," but, and I think about, some of the best experts in how we're doing as a county government, which fundamentally we're tasked with delivering services, is the people who use those services. So whether that's people who are biking on roads that do or don't have bike lanes, or whether that's somebody who's enrolled in the WIC program, or whether that's somebody who is in the juvenile justice system, those are the experts in how we're doing. And I think those are some of the least likely folks to even know that anybody wants to hear what their experience is, let alone how to share it or how to offer their ideas. There are plenty of people that know and aren't afraid to pick up a phone or fire off an email or come here and give public comment, but we're missing a lot of voices and a lot of experience. And then similarly, internally in the organization, right? We're, by definition, as you were saying, Corey, we're designed. Initially, we are a government, and government was not created to be inclusive, very intentionally. In fact, it was intentionally created to be exclusive. And so as an organization, how are we making sure our own workforce understands where and how to weigh in and give feedback in a way that's safe for them to do? So this is really exciting forever work. And so thank you for carrying it. My questions and thoughts, particularly as it relates to committee work, is yes to what does the application look like, and yes to how are we recruiting, but even the sort of what are those committees for, and do committee members know what they're for, and how are we using? I mean, that's a lot of human capital, and it's also a lot of staff time to staff those committees and prepare the materials and then put the recommendations together. So I'm really thinking of it sort of an overly crass way as sort of what's the return on investment for what we're putting into these committees, and what kind of experience folks are getting out of it, and then how much is that informing the board in particular, because most of our committees are advisory to the board. I have seen, just in my not even quite 2 years here already, some real good work come out when we structure things more as work groups or task forces instead of standing committees, who then tend to sort of get in the habit of meeting, even if there isn't something substantive for them to work on. So I think about like the Parks Funding Task Force, for example, where it's like you have a specific problem you're helping us solve, and you're putting some extra thinking power and time and attention and content knowledge and motivation to it. So I think there's some different models we could look at too, not just the materials and the mechanisms for recruiting people into committees. I think about often too, we get committees and then they get subcommittees, and the subcommittees have work groups and subcommittees of the work group to the committee, and it can get a little much. That said, there are some that are critically important. I think of the League, the Lived Experience Advisory Group, as part of the Poverty and Homelessness Board. Again, going back to where I started my comments, the people who are interfacing with the services and experiencing the issue we're investing in addressing are absolutely the experts. I love hearing about thinking about how we're applying equity lens to things like economic development and granting and contracting. That is very exciting. I also would love to think about it in terms of procurement. I know there's some little bits and pieces that are already happening there. So that's great. And then, and I love, thank you for providing all those great examples of how different divisions and departments are already doing the work. Sometimes we're doing stuff, we just don't have a name for it yet. And you're giving a name to it. So that's fantastic. My question is, how are we working to create some cohesion and integration of all these different equity plans across different divisions? Particularly, I mean, public health has an entire, the whole bucket that holds all of their work is an equity framework around social determinants of health. So how are we sort of working to integrate across different departments within the organization?
So, and I might not be the person to answer this, or I might just be the messy person to answer this, because that's been a question of mine as well. I think that's one of the joys of coming in from the outside and thinking and having this idea of what I thought it was, and then getting inside and going, oh, there's really, like, people are doing work in different ways and are at different places in terms of how they're thinking about that work. So I don't know yet how, other than I personally am like wading in and being like, hey, can we meet? Can I hear how this is working? And I feel like maybe you might want to bring somebody from HR in on that, because you're talking about these things. It's not in any way, I don't know that, and maybe these two folks have a way more like understanding of how we might do that than I do, but I'm just starting to really kind of unpack it and say, there's so much opportunity for that, and to figure out how do we do more of that cross-departmental stuff, and how do we make sure that, and I know this is one of the things that probably keeps Judy up at night, it's like, how do we make sure that it all fits within the same sort of strategic work? And that was shush.
Yeah, I would just add, I think what Corey said is true. We're still going through the process of, this has been a good discussion, and part of what we've talked about is a recognition that equity work is constantly evolving and changing. And in a large, diverse in terms of the types of services that we provide and the different types of work that our employees do and the different ways in which we touch the community. The expectation that everyone is going to be at the same place on this journey at the same time is unreasonable. You mentioned public health, and I think, there's an understanding that, public health and health and human services, by nature of the type of work that they do and the populations that they serve, they have oftentimes, more likely than not, been more advanced on the equity journey than other parts of the organization. And I think one of the things that we are really working to do as we bolster the central role of our organizational and community-wide leadership around equity work is to recognize that it's okay to accept that there are different people at different spectrums on that journey, different places on that journey. But it's also realistic to acknowledge, I think, that there's the potential for some conflict there, because some people, may feel like, no, this is the path and this is the way to go, and others may not. And so we've had conversations about the difference between leading with race, which, has been a leading practice of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and cultures of belonging, which continues to grow and evolve in its utilization and implementation in various forms, particularly in the public sector. And in conversations that Latife and I have had and Corey and I have had, I think our feeling is like, well, we need to allow for all of this work to advance. It's not a one or the other. It's a recognition, understanding again, that there are different places in the journey. So that's a long answer to your question. Are we incorporating different plans and ideas? Yes, but that work isn't complete yet. And we're still trying to sort of build all of those relationships and understanding about what's happening. I will make a plug that one of the things that we're restarting our leadership summit. So these leadership summits were an annual, excuse me, an annual convening of several hundred of our leaders across the organization in Lane County. And we sort of took a pause through the pandemic. I think we did a virtual one year that was okay, but we're going to get back in person again. And the theme for one of the primary themes for this leadership summit for, again, several hundred leaders in our organization is going to be cultures of belonging. And so beginning to have these conversations, the one we did last time in the Wheeler Pavilion was what was facilitated by the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, focused on leading with race, right? And so that was 4 years ago, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. So anyways, I know that's a lot, but you know, the journey continues and a lot of work to do there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to be clear and to be fair, it's a variation of the answer I expected, and it's the right answer in that we don't necessarily want just one. My question was less like, why do we have all these different plans? Why can't we align them? It's, and I knew the answer. Are we talking to each other? Because there's a lot of rich learning to be had across different departments and the individuals that bring their experience working in that department and with the constituents that they're working with and how they're delivering services. So it was less any kind of, yes, there are such things as duplication or redundancy, and that's inefficient. But in this case, it's just, there's such a richness. There's so much good work happening across the organization that I'm just wanting to be sure that the people doing it are connecting with each other, because people learn at different rates and paces, and sometimes from a peer and sometimes from a leader. And so that was really where that question was coming from. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Further questions or comments? Commissioner Butler.
Briefly, I just want to appreciate that we're a county that is putting this forward up front and modeling it for a lot of other communities, including our smaller cities, and who are just now maybe tapping in to some of this work. I do also recall earlier when you mentioned that we're working within systems that may not be designed for the people we actually need to operate those systems. And how do we go about knowing that we still need to get the work done, but doing it in perhaps a different way where we're attracting those folks that we know are really good at that work, but it was never something that they would consider before because it couldn't fit within their lives, or they felt like it wasn't a culture that they wanted to be a part of or wouldn't accept them. In providing more inclusivity for a variety of folks that would be interested in those positions is just hugely important, especially when we're considering that we're having a hard time attracting people like everybody else. And this change since COVID has happened in knowing that we want to attract the cream of the crop here in Lane County. It's vital, or we will shrink our pool of folks that are really interested but maybe very, very good at the jobs we need to get done here at the county. I'm pretty sure when I was a child, the Board of County Commissioners was not set up in a way in which I should be sitting here today. And the way in which the county now is trying to make changes in order to make sure that we are inclusive of all folks, all genders, all races, is vital to me being here, but it's also vital for, and I think of it in the mind of vital for those people who want to work for the county and would, but for this reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Then I see no further hands raised for the queue, but once again, the body of work in front of us is tremendous. And if we view it as this next step along the way, as Ms. Mokraski said, the plan is evolving. Every single day, we find ways to clarify the lens and to look through the lens more clearly and more inclusively. And I really I look back on Steve, when you came on board, it was one of the first things that you and I talked about. Is how do we begin to instill a system of equity in Lane County that previously didn't exist prior to your coming on board? And that's when I first met Mo, and you established a small group of people, and Mo was the person at the whiteboard, taking all of the notes from this small group of people that came up with just a volume of work for you to consider, Mr. Mokraski, before you determined that the equity board was a good way to move forward with it. And at that point in time, that was 2016, I believe, that the equity board was formed, and you put it forward as a county board, and that was a novel approach, I thought at the time, but it really did prove to be a very effective approach because it helped us to look internally before we started projecting externally, to take a real hard look at how we are functioning as a government, how Lane County is functioning as a government. And I think that we've made tremendous strides, but the greatest stride is to realize that we have a long journey ahead of us. And that's where we are today. So Councilor Ms. Rodley, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And anything else you need to add on that, Mr. Mokraski? Any summary from you all?
Thank you. And just continue. I think that when you all were talking, I am both extremely optimistic, and some of you know me, I also have a really high capacity for the mess and the conflict, which is why I keep doing this work. And I think that the county administrator is absolutely right that it's like, that's what I loved about the butterfly. Like there's needs to be multiple points of entry, and just having these conversations about how do we do this? What feels good for you? What does not feel good for you? Is this every day? I'm like, am I harming? Am I helping? And that's part of it, right? Like we can't go from here to here without lots of stumbles, and knowing that it's just hard work. And I just appreciate you all continuing to sort of hold the feet to the fire and to set those board resolutions and set those expectations so that we continue to do this work, because that's such a key piece of it. So thank you for that.
And we'll finish with a quote, which I like to use quotes. This morning I quoted Robert Burns, among others. I'm going to make a quote here. It's, we should all make the lens a part of our daily work and make a new reality of systemic vitality and sustainable change. Let's take the next step together to make Lane County a great place to live, work, and play for all of Lane County's people and communities. And who said that? Well, that was, oh yeah, it was me. Actually, this is a letter at the very start of the Equity Lens documents. Well, thank you very much once again.
Thank
you. Then we'll move down the agenda to item 14A, which is Commissioner's business. Do we have any announcements among the board? I'm looking for hands raised. Seem to be no announcements that we've not covered already. Any future board assignment requests? Commissioner Bernie telegraphed one this morning, but the outcome of that vote, I think, made that future board assignment request not necessary, perhaps, where he suggested that we take a look in perhaps September of next year to see how the state's progress is toward actually providing a system to cover the PLO, the personal leave. So I don't know that we need that.
Well, if you wanted it, I would suggest an annual assignment or an assignment sometime really in early or sometime in 2024, because the program doesn't get implemented until September of 23.
23, right?
Yeah.
But in the
So
meantime,
if you want an update, I mean, I think the issue was either way. You know, if we were to contract with a private contractor, there were some questions about how that would go. The board has decided to go with the state. And so there certainly were some questions about how that was going to go. So if you want an update on that, we certainly can do it. But I would suggest something later than November of 23, which is what Commissioner Bernie suggested.
Then I suggest we leave that as not an assignment, but just as a state of being that as we move forward, because we don't know what the state's going to be able to do. And we start paying administrative fees to the state, I believe it was January 1st is when we start giving them money. And we don't get anything back until September. So I don't know what to expect there. So I guess as we keep an eye on what they might be doing, if they give us updates on whether or not and how their plan is going to work, I'll be really excited to hear that. But I won't suggest it as an assignment. Then no other assignments. Nothing much to review, Mr. Markowski.
Hey, I have a quick update on elections, and after the
Yeah.
update, if you'd like to hear that.
Please.
As of 1:37, what was that, an hour and 45 minutes ago? 1,000, let me read that right. 147,016 ballots have been received. That is 20,615 ballots from today. Remember, we estimated another 66,000 ballots today. So, excuse me, as of 1:37, we had received an additional 20,615. A quick breakdown by source of the total 147,016 ballots received. 98,000 are from drop boxes and 47,000 are from the USP Postal Service. The busiest drop box is Amazon Pool. Congratulations, Commissioner Trigger. Followed by the election office box. Congratulations again, Commissioner Trigger. That's your district. Ballot collection teams are out on their second run now. This was an hour and 45 minutes ago. They're on their second run and will finish up one final round for the 8 p.m. box closures. Again, they'll be there right at 8 to take those last ballots delivered right at 7:59:59. Right now, the ballot sorting team is the star of the show, getting all the ballots batched. So these are the ones that had not been counted as of late yesterday, that were received by yesterday. So the ballot sorting team is getting the ballots batched, so signature verification can occur. Then the ballots that are accepted at signature, so the signatures match, signature verification, are ready to be what we say called deconstructed, which means they're opened and sorted and get it prepared to be counted, to go through the sorter and the counter. When the teams arrive at 3 p.m. So that's happening right now. Oh, there it is. Okay, we have the video
I
up.
was going to ask if we could see.
Yeah. So that is that looks like that is the sorting room. So the ballots are being deconstructed now from those teams. The deconstruction teams will be at elections until after 11 p.m. The counting will start at 4 p.m. So they're still doing the signature verification and the sorting, and the counting starts at 4 p.m. from those new ballots that were received today. And they will stay until around 11 p.m. as well. So again, the ballots those will get reported at 11 p.m. Remember, we said 8 p.m. will be the ballots that were counted as of close of business yesterday. 11 p.m. will be the ballots, likely the better portion of those 20,000 that were received earlier today. And then those received at the drop boxes after that. So by, between now and 8 p.m. and then those received over the next few days through the Postal Service will likely be part of counting that occurs after today. That's all I have.
That's a lot. So we have, so people have to be in line by 7:59 and 59 in order to make sure the ballot gets, but they have to be in line. I'm presuming that there'll be a barricade at the end of the line and people show up after that. Sorry, all. There's no latitude on that.
The election workers that are at those ballot drop boxes will tell people if they're too late, because they will literally, lock the box at 8 sharp.
That would be a very discouraging thing to see. Would be a locked box when you had 9 ballots in hand, right? Well, very good. Then thanks for that update, and we'll all be keeping an eye on the on Lane County Elections website at around 8 o'clock this evening for the first returns. Then we have no reason for executive session this afternoon. We will be down for the next 2 weeks, although there will be some form of executive session next week for consideration of employment of individuals. Other than that, our next regularly scheduled board meeting is November 29th at 9 a.m. in this hall. Good afternoon. We're adjourned.